Okay, so we finished up Chapter 4, the culture and religion in Eurasia and North Africa. And Chapter 5 focuses on society and inequality in Eurasia and North Africa. Same time period, 500 BCE to CE. And we're going to start with society and the state in China. Okay, let's talk about this statue. It shows two female figures, probably a mother and a child. It looks like both have long hair and headgear that they're both wearing, rather elaborate here. Earrings and some thick bracelets, and even belts, some elaborate belts on both of them. With the exception of this shawl that hangs over the mother's right shoulder, both don't look like they're wearing very much clothing. The mother's bracelets, earrings, and the headgear seems more ornate and elaborate than the child. And she's holding her on one arm on her hip. And both are turned toward whoever the spectator is, so they're facing the same direction. And the statue comes from the Sung Dynasty, or Sungya Dynasty in eastern India, about 185 BCE to 73 BCE. Now let's talk about why the artist chose this image. It celebrates the tie between the mother and the child. The similarity between the mother and the child stresses, the importance of this relationship for the transmission of values and traditions within a society. And the position of both their bodies toward the spectator underlines the fact that this statue is not so much a celebration of motherly protection, but the mother's role in raising what would become future adults. Okay. Now, the caste system is still central to present-day India, and the period 1750 to the present challenged many social structures that were once immutable. There was a series of revolutions that destroyed the monarchies and the class hierarchies, the abolition of slavery, and there have been women's movements, and even Gandhi in the early 20th century in his efforts to raise the status of untouchables. Those are at the bottom of the Indian social structure. And there are patterns of inequality that have generated social tensions during the second wave civilizations as well. And the second wave civilizations were hierarchical and patriarchal in nature, but they varied in how they organized their societies. And that's where we pick up with China. So Chinese society was more shaped by state actions rather than their societies. There was an immense social prestige and political power of the state officials in China, and these officials were seen as the cultural and the social elite. So it went beyond just being the political elite. A great example of an elite of officials is the world's first professional civil service exam began here. In 124 BCE, Wu Di established an imperial academy for officials. And the emperor and this imperial academy created a formal school for future bureaucrats to study the Confucian classics as preparation for government service. And the exam systems were entered into the civil service based on passing this exam, and the exams were focused on the Confucian classics. It was open to all males, regardless of social status. There was an example of a pig farmer, I believe, who became an imperial advisor. However, as the exam required years of study, only those with access to enough wealth that could educate their sons to spend time on studying for the exam usually are the ones that succeeded. So the system did favor the wealthy. About 30,000 students had entered into the civil service by the end of the Han Dynasty, and the written exams were used to select these officials, and it lasted until the early 20th century, until the early 1900s. So like I said, it favored the wealthy. They could afford to educate their sons. They were also usually lived close to the capital, and so family connections were important, and it was possible for commoners to rise through education, like I gave that example of the pig farmer. But it really pointed to the privilege and the prestige. Once the candidate passed the exam and became a civil servant, their social status rose greatly. They were celebrated in their home villages and towns. They were the source of family pride. And these civil servants enjoyed special carriages and fancy robes, as well as various social privileges. So they were frequently hailed as symbols of sophistication for their refined behavior and speech. Okay, let's talk about the landlord class. Okay, by the 1st century BCE, small-scale peasant farmers had been displaced by large landowners and tenant farmers. And the state opposed the creation of these large estates throughout Chinese history, but without much success. The large landowners could often evade taxes, and they sometimes kept independent military forces that could challenge any type of imperial authority. But these reforms were by the usurper Wang Meng about the year 8 to 23 CE. And the land and agricultural production had been a major source of wealth in China for 1,000 years. And during the Qin dynasty, most land was worked and held by these peasant families. But as the rise of these large estates during the 1st century, there were population pressures and taxation, and that led to wealthier landowners to buy up that land of those economically desperate peasants. And the wealthy landowners used their increasing power to avoid taxes and, like I said, raise armies to challenge the state. So, but this Wang Meng, this court official, he usurped the throne and engaged in a systematic attack on the large estates. He was a firm Confucian. He believed that a strong and healthy peasant class was the backbone of society. And his program of nationalizing and redistributing land and setting limits on the size of land holdings and offering government loans to those small farmers really put an end to private slavery that provoked a reaction from the wealthy elite and eventually led to his assassination. And as the landlord class had more access to wealth, they could sponsor young men to study for the civil service, hence the government bureaucracy. So even though it was open to all who were educated along the Confucian teachings, it was really dominated by the landlords. So here's the Han Empire in blue, a shaded bluish purple area. Up here in the stripes, this is the area of the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And this is roughly about 100 BCE. The Han Dynasty lasts for another 100 or so years. But you could see it encompassed a large portion. And the Han Empire is the same time as the Romans, for example, lots of trading between the two, so give you a little bit of context there. Okay, let's move on to the peasants. In Chinese history, most of the population's been peasants, even today. Some have been relatively prosperous, which I know defeats the meaning of the word peasant. And then some have barely survived, which sounds more like what a peasant is. The tenant farmers in the Han Dynasty owed as much as 2/3 of their crop to landowners. And that's a lot to pay in taxes. That's 66% that are paid in taxes. And so that's a lot of pressure on peasants. Rents, taxes, military service, even forced labor to the government, combined with natural disasters like floods and crop failures, that put heavy burdens on the backs of those Chinese peasants. And in hard times, those in poverty, succumbed to famine, yet others fled to become beggars or even bandits. And so thus comes these periodic peasant rebellions. And this is the one we're going to talk about here is the Yellow Turban Rebellion. That's the one that was on the map there, up in the northern Han Empire. It was provoked by flooding and epidemics. There we go. There's a series of floods and diseases. Wandering bands of peasants joined together, and they formed this pretty large popular movement that reached about 300 and so 60,000 followers. Now, they used Taoism and mystical rituals to really unify themselves under one set of ideas, and they called for this new age of equality and peace. But the Han military eventually put down the rebellion. But the rebellion and the military campaign really weakened the state. It contributed, actually, to the eventual collapse of the Han Empire. Okay, let's talk about merchants. The Chinese cultural elite really disliked the merchants. Okay, now let's talk about the merchants. So the Chinese cultural elite really disliked the merchants. They were generally stereotyped as greedy and profited from the work of others. And they were seen as a social threat to the elite because they were viewed as also impoverishing others. Now, there were periodic efforts to control merchants and the profit that they made. There were some sumptuary laws. They were forbidden to hold public office. Even state monopolies on some industries like salt, iron, and alcohol. And it forced them to make loans to the state. So merchants they often prospered. Anyway, despite these restrictions, they won their way to respectability by purchasing estates and then educating their sons. And officials and landlords were willing to work with them. So despite the shameful profits and the dubious morality, peasants were poor. They were held in high moral esteem by the Confucian state ideology. As, like I mentioned earlier, that backbone of a healthy society. Merchants, on the other hand, were seen as dishonest and deceitful, and thus of poor moral quality. And they were seen as keeping revenue from the state, thus the loans. And so with these restrictions and the exclusion from the state service, to keep the merchants in check. And the state placed those restrictions on them, excluded them. But nonetheless, the merchants found corrupt officials willing to work with them and eventually schemed their way into putting their sons into the Confucian bureaucracy by educating them and having them pass those tests. And the merchants were even barred from certain economic activities, like I said, the salt, iron, and alcohol. But also forced to give money to the state, which of course the state never repaid. And that is it of society and the state in China. We'll look at the class and caste systems of India next.